They didn't just strike Iran's nuclear program, they tried to erase it, like yanking a live grenade out of the hands of a man who's smiling while counting down from 3. Welcome to What If Horizons, the podcast where we don't just explain today's headlines, we interrogate the alternate futures they threaten to unleash. I'm your host, your loyal guide through this beautiful mess we call geopolitics, and today's story is more than a headline. It's an air raid wrapped in a strategy dipped in global consequences. Let's set the stage. Just days ago, Israel launched what it calls Operation Rising Lion. Don't let the name fool you. It wasn't a symbolic gesture or a slow-moving campaign. It was fast, brutal, and comprehensive. In just 4 days, Israeli jets, drones, and covert teams targeted over 100 Iranian sites. Nuclear facilities like Natanz and Fordow weren't just bombed, they were pulverized. High-ranking IRGC commanders, gone. 6 nuclear scientists, silenced. And this wasn't just about buildings or bombs, this was about sending a message. Loud enough to echo from Tel Aviv to Tehran, and unnerving enough to make every global capital suddenly sit up and Google, "Can you assassinate a nuclear program?" Iran, of course, didn't blink. It retaliated with waves of missiles and drones targeting Israeli bases, infrastructure, and, tragically, civilian areas. The U.S. stepped in, sort of. Its air defense systems in the Gulf helped intercept some incoming fire, but Washington was careful not to pull a trigger. Not yet. But here's the question nobody wants to ask out loud. What if Israel succeeded? What if this wasn't just a blow to Iran's nuclear ambitions, but the fatal one? What if, for the first time since this long, slow dance began, the Middle East's most feared weapons program was, poof, gone? And even more unsettling, what if dismantling the bomb also dismantled the regime? That's the thought experiment we're diving into today. Stay with me. The precision of Operation Rising Lion wasn't accidental. This was years, maybe decades in the making. Israeli intelligence, already famous for playing global chess while others are playing checkers, had long been mapping out every detail: where the centrifuges spun, who managed them, which engineers were irreplaceable, which military commanders couldn't be allowed to draw breath the next morning. The first wave hit like a thunderclap. Over 200 aircraft crossed into Iranian airspace under the cover of advanced electronic warfare that blinded Iran's air defenses. Simultaneously, a swarm of drones, some launched from covert forward positions, others from submarines in the Gulf, rushed towards secondary targets. Natanz, Iran's crown jewel of uranium enrichment, was reduced to rubble. Fordow, deep inside a mountain and once thought untouchable, suffered what insiders call surgical obliteration, a polite term for, essentially, pulverization with bunker busters. But this was not just a bombing campaign, it was decapitation. 6 nuclear scientists, all critical to Iran's enrichment calculations, were eliminated almost simultaneously, some in their labs, others in their vehicles. Several high-ranking commanders within the IRGC, the elite Revolutionary Guard Corps, were taken out in a coordinated strike that left the upper echelons of Iran's military command in disarray. It wasn't just the facilities that were targeted, it was the very knowledge and leadership structure behind them. Israel wasn't content with breaking the machine, they went after the mechanics too. Iran's response was swift but fragmented. Hundreds of missiles and drones were fired at Israeli cities and military installations. Some reached their targets, causing tragic civilian casualties. Many were intercepted by Israel's Iron Dome and the sophisticated U.S.-built air defenses stationed across the region. Civilians on both sides braced for what felt like the opening moves of something far larger, a regional war that could spiral out of control. Meanwhile, the diplomatic world scrambled. Nuclear talks in Oman collapsed overnight. European envoys flew home. The UN held emergency meetings that produced plenty of grave expressions, but very few actionable decisions. The United States found itself balancing on the knife's edge, providing critical support to Israel's defense while carefully avoiding any direct offensive participation. Washington issued its carefully worded statements, supportive of Israel's right to defend itself, while vaguely urging de-escalation, as if reading from a script that's been used too many times before. But something was different this time. The sheer scale of destruction had crossed an invisible threshold. Iran's nuclear program wasn't simply damaged, it was, perhaps for the first time, functionally dismantled. And with it, the fragile internal equilibrium of the Iranian regime began to wobble dangerously. And now, this is where our what if truly begins, because when you break not only a nation's weapons, but its very sense of invulnerability, you don't just alter their foreign policy, you shake the ground under their entire political system. So what exactly does it mean to fully dismantle a nuclear program? Because contrary to Hollywood's obsession with a big red button, a nuclear arsenal isn't a single device you can unplug and call it a day. It's a sprawling, complex spiderweb of technology, infrastructure, and most importantly, people. Technically speaking, Operation Rising Lion went after three critical pillars. First, the facilities, the visible parts. Centrifuge halls, enrichment bunkers, research labs were smashed beyond repair. It wasn't just Natanz and Fordow. Lesser-known facilities, hidden labs scattered around the countryside, research nodes embedded in universities, and military-controlled storage sites all faced the same fate: annihilation. It wasn't enough to delay enrichment by months or even years. Israel's goal was to reset the nuclear clock entirely, putting Iran back to square zero. Second, the scientists. Nukes don't build themselves. Nuclear science is not something you can download off Wikipedia, though, let's be honest, some of us have tried. Iran's top physicists, metallurgists, and enrichment experts were either eliminated or forced into hiding. You can rebuild a facility. You can't easily replace 30 years of experience in isotope separation. And third, leadership. The IRGC wasn't simply the muscle behind Iran's nuclear program, it was the spine. By taking out senior commanders, Israel delivered not just a tactical blow, but a psychological one. Without a clear chain of command, the military-industrial complex that fuels Iran's nuclear ambitions suddenly found itself adrift. Orders were confused, priorities scrambled, factions within the regime began jostling for power. The machine wasn't just damaged, it was leaderless. Strategically, this trifecta of destruction did something almost unprecedented in modern covert warfare. It took Iran's nuclear capability off the board entirely, not for months or years, but possibly for decades. But the real question isn't just whether Israel succeeded technically. The real question is, what does a decapitated Iran look like politically? When you destroy not just a country's weapons, but its pride, its deterrence, and its sense of invincibility, you create something far more unpredictable. And as we'll see next, unpredictability in the Middle East usually doesn't end with champagne toasts and Nobel Peace Prizes. In the immediate aftermath, the headlines might declare victory: Iran's nuclear program neutralized. But beneath those headlines, an entirely different and far messier story begins to unfold. First, there's the nuclear rollback itself. With its core facilities reduced to smoldering craters, Iran's ability to enrich uranium is gone. The centrifuges are destroyed. The underground bunkers are compromised. The stockpiles of enriched uranium, those carefully shielded caches of nuclear ambition, either vaporized in explosions or captured by special forces who know exactly which containers to grab. There's no covert lab left operating in the shadows, no secret enrichment happening deep in mountains or hidden basements. For the first time in decades, Iran is, quite simply, out of the nuclear game. But here's where the real volatility kicks in. Inside Iran, the regime itself begins to fracture. The assassination of senior IRGC commanders doesn't just leave military gaps, it ignites political chaos. The hardline factions who depended on these figures for stability and influence suddenly find their power bases weakened. Reformist factions, long marginalized and brutalized, sense opportunity. Protests, already simmering due to years of economic sanctions and domestic oppression, surge once more, but now fueled by regime humiliation. The supreme leader's inner circle becomes paranoid, issuing crackdowns, purges, and mass arrests in a desperate attempt to hold on to power. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens, already battered by sanctions, watch their currency devalue further as global markets react to the instability. Every Iranian knows what's at stake, not just the end of the nuclear program, but potentially the end of the Islamic Republic itself. And while the regime fights for survival, the specter of retaliation looms large. Iran may have lost much of its conventional military muscle, but its playbook is far from empty. The regime turns to its asymmetric arsenal: Hezbollah in Lebanon, Shiite militias in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, and countless sleeper cells scattered across the globe. Proxy wars flare up like brush fires across the region. Israeli embassies abroad brace for terror plots. Cyber attacks flood Israeli banks, energy grids, and government servers. Oil tankers in the Strait of Hormuz suddenly find themselves playing an updated version of Russian roulette as mines and drones stalk the shipping lanes. And all of this unfolds while Iran's conventional military remains paralyzed, its leadership shattered, and its nuclear ambitions in ruins. It's like a wounded lion, still dangerous, still lethal, but lashing out blindly in every direction. The question now isn't whether Iran can rebuild its nuclear program anytime soon. It can't. The question is whether the regime itself can survive long enough to even try.
When a country as large, as ideologically driven, and as geopolitically central as Iran begins to wobble, it doesn't just fall quietly into the night. It sends shockwaves. And in the Middle East, shockwaves don't dissipate, they ricochet. Let's start with the neighbors, the Gulf states. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, they've all played a tightrope game with Iran for decades, publicly cautious, privately skeptical, and strategically opportunistic. But now, with Iran's nuclear capability gone and its leadership in freefall, their caution turns into calculation. They quietly welcome the rollback of a nuclear Iran, but they're also watching the growing instability next door like someone sitting next to a lit firework who isn't sure whether to run or pray. Saudi Arabia in particular sees a window. With the IRGC wounded, Tehran's influence in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen begins to wobble. Riyadh might seize this moment to push back hard against Iranian proxies. The war in Yemen could tilt in Saudi Arabia's favor. Shiite militias in Iraq might suddenly find their funding mysteriously drying up. It's a rare opening in a region where openings don't last long. But the risks are just as real. If Iran implodes into internal chaos, the resulting instability doesn't stop at its borders. Refugees could pour into neighboring states. Sectarian violence might reignite in places where it had been carefully suppressed. And worst of all, if the regime falls, who or what takes its place? And then there's oil. Glorious, slippery, geopolitically radioactive oil. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow choke point through which a fifth of the world's crude flows daily, suddenly becomes the world's most dangerous chessboard. Iran, desperate and enraged, could disrupt shipping lanes with mines, drones, or missile strikes. Even the threat of this is enough to send oil prices skyrocketing. Traders don't wait for explosions, they react to rumors. And rumors, in a world where Iran just got gutted, come faster than logic. Gas prices in New York jump overnight, inflation ticks up in Berlin, Factory bosses in Shenzhen start hoarding energy futures. The world economy, already walking a post-COVID, post-Ukraine tightrope, starts to sweat. Meanwhile, global alliances shift. Israel, suddenly basking in the glow of strategic triumph, finds itself in a stronger position diplomatically. Its once clandestine ties with Gulf monarchies could now evolve into open alliances. Riyadh might finally stop playing coy about normalization. The Abraham Accords might get a sequel, the Persian Gulf Protocol. Anyone? But this doesn't happen in a vacuum. China and Russia, both eager to expand their footprint in the Middle East, smell opportunity. With Iran's government weakened, they might increase support for fringe factions or even step in as mediators. Moscow sends diplomats. Beijing offers reconstruction assistance with a side of surveillance tech. The old Cold War ghosts peek out from the curtains, grinning. In other words, a world without a nuclear Iran is not necessarily a safer world. It might just be a different kind of dangerous.
And now comes the part where international lawyers sharpen their pencils. Diplomats reach for their strongest synonyms for deeply concerned, and world leaders pretend they didn't know anything about anything. Was Operation Rising Lion legal? Israel, of course, says yes, loudly, firmly, and with every ounce of confidence it can muster. The doctrine of anticipatory self-defense is their legal shield. In simple terms, if you believe someone is preparing to attack you with a nuclear weapon, you don't wait for the countdown to reach zero. You hit first, and you hit hard. Under Article 51 of the UN Charter, self-defense is permitted if an armed attack occurs or if one is imminent. Israel's case hinges entirely on that last word, imminent. They argue that Iran's nuclear enrichment, ballistic missile development, and open threats to Israel's existence made the attack not only legal, but morally necessary. But, as always, not everyone is buying it. Critics argue that the scope and scale of the strikes were wildly disproportionate. Hundreds of sorties, dozens of high-value targets, civilian casualties, entire cities thrown into blackout. This wasn't a surgical strike. It was major surgery without anesthesia. International human rights organizations begin publishing reports before the smoke is even cleared. Was every scientist a legitimate military target? What about the civilian technicians? What about the missile strikes that Iran launched in response, which were themselves retaliatory but also killed civilians in Tel Aviv? The lines blur fast in modern warfare, especially when the war is being live-streamed on multiple continents. And then there's Washington, the world's most awkward dance partner. The United States provided crucial intelligence, early warning satellite data, and regional missile defense systems that protected Israeli airspace from Iranian counterattacks. But U.S. fighter jets never entered Iranian airspace, not one bomb dropped by America, officially. Washington issues its well-practiced statement, "We fully support Israel's right to defend itself while encouraging all parties to de-escalate tensions." Translation, "We helped, but don't drag us to The Hague." Behind closed doors, American diplomats begin fielding calls from Europe, China, Russia, and even their own nervous allies in the Middle East. Nobody wants to see Iran with nukes, but nobody wants to see World War III over it either. The United Nations holds an Emergency Security Council meeting. Strong words are exchanged. Resolutions are proposed. Russia vetoes. China abstains. Europe drafts a joint statement that says something meaningful, but only after 14 rounds of translation and edit that remove anything too enthusiastic. And thus, the legal debate stalls, just like so many before it. Israel stands firm. Iran screams aggression. The rest of the world quietly hopes that whatever comes next, it doesn't involve mushroom clouds. This is the part of the show where we usually call in an expert, and this time we did just that. We reached out to Dr. Leila Farzaneh, a senior Middle East analyst with the International Crisis Bureau, and someone who, according to one UN diplomat, knows more about the Iranian regime than the Ayatollah's barber. Here's a short excerpt from our interview. Dr. Farzaneh, people misunderstand Iran's regime. It's not one power structure. It's three, maybe four, layered like a paranoid wedding cake. You have the supreme leader, the IRGC, the clerical establishment, and the civilian government that pretends to matter. What Rising Lion did was knock the frosting off the top and stab the knife through the middle. The result? Chaos. Interviewer: is that chaos survivable? Dr. Farzaneh: maybe, but we've never seen the IRGC this exposed, this leaderless. If reformist factions unite, which is a big if, we could see regime collapse. But more likely, you get a power vacuum that sucks in radicals, warlords, and foreign interests like a geopolitical Dyson. Now, let's unpack that. What Dr. Farzaneh is warning us about isn't just regime instability, it's regime entropy, a system where the pillars holding the roof together start blaming each other for the leaks. The IRGC starts internal purges. Klamics begin hedging their bets. Reformists either go underground or start cautiously speaking above a whisper for the first time in decades. And when that kind of entropy sets in, two things happen. First, governance collapses. Ministries stop coordinating. Local security forces become little fiefdoms. Regions like Khuzestan or Sistan-Baluchistan, which have always had rested populations, begin to slip from Tehran's grasp. And second, outside players smell blood. And not just global powers, regional actors too. Kurdish separatists in the northwest, Arab populations in the oil-rich southwest, Baluchi militants in the southeast, each with a score to settle and a foreign patron willing to help. So is this the beginning of a post-theocratic Iran? Maybe. Or it could be the beginning of something far worse, a hollowed-out state clinging to old flags while its borders dissolve from the inside out. As Dr. Farzaneh put it bluntly off-air, when you kill the regime's generals, you don't just behead the Hydra, you sometimes uncage the wolves. Now that we've stared directly into the eye of the collapsing regime, let's take a breath and ask the big, uncomfortable question. What does the future look like? Let's start with the best-case scenario, the one that foreign policy think tanks fantasize about while sipping espresso in Brussels. In this dream version of post-Operation Rising Lion Iran, the hardliners fall. Reformist forces, composed of secular activists, disillusioned youth, moderate clerics, and technocrats in exile, form a transitional government. The Revolutionary Guard splinters, its power neutered by defection, arrests, or sheer exhaustion. Iran reopens nuclear talks, agrees to permanent inspections, reestablishes ties with the West, and rejoins the global economy. The Iranian rial stabilizes. Apple opens a flagship store in Tehran. Netflix commissions a prestige drama about the revolution. Everyone claps. Now let's turn off the fantasy and look at the worst-case scenario. The regime collapses, but not into democracy, into anarchy. Without a centralized command, Iran becomes a mosaic of militias, tribal regions, separatist enclaves, and black market economies. The nuclear threat is gone, but so is stability. Armed factions fight for control of strategic cities. Oil infrastructure is sabotaged by rival clans. Proxy groups, from Hezbollah to the Houthis, no longer report to Tehran but act independently, spreading chaos with no leash and no logic. And here's the catch. In this version, there's no longer a regime to negotiate with, contain, or deter. There's just a broken state sitting on a pile of oil and unresolved ethnic tensions, surrounded by anxious neighbors and opportunistic superpowers. Think Syria, but with 80 million people and vastly more dangerous geography. But most plausible? The middle ground, the strategic drift. In this scenario, the Islamic Republic doesn't vanish, it just mutates. The supreme leader becomes more symbolic than sovereign.
The IRGC retreats inward, consolidating power through economic control rather than ideology. The nuclear program, while damaged, is quietly restarted underground, but with greater caution and even more secrecy. Iran doesn't lash out dramatically. It bleeds quietly through asymmetric warfare, proxy entanglements, and cyber-sabotage. It becomes the ghost in the Middle Eastern machine. And this version might be the most dangerous of all, because a visibly aggressive Iran you can deter. A broken Iran you can manage. But a wounded, invisible Iran? That's the kind that poisons stability one bite, one drone, one militia at a time, without ever crossing the threshold that would justify another rising lion. So as the world debates what happens next, one truth remains uncomfortably clear. There is no neat, triumphant ending to this story, only evolving chapters, each one harder to predict than the last.
And now we arrive at the true heart of the matter, the what-if moment that keeps every strategist awake at 3 a.m., staring at maps and whispering prayers into their half-empty coffee cups. What if Iran no longer has a nuclear program, but no regime either? On the surface, the world breathes easier. The nuclear threat that haunted Israel, terrified Saudi Arabia, and kept Washington on edge for years is erased. No uranium enrichment, no warheads, no doomsday countdown. The immediate existential nightmare is over. But beneath that surface lies something even more dangerous, a power vacuum in one of the most volatile neighborhoods on Earth. Imagine the map. To Iran's west, Iraq, already unstable, suddenly faces an influx of refugees, rogue militias, and arms flowing across their long, porous border. Baghdad's own fragile government begins to splinter under the weight. To Iran's east, Afghanistan, a place where governance was always more of a polite suggestion, finds new opportunities for narco-traffickers, arms smugglers, and radical jihadist groups looking for ungoverned space to operate in. To the south, the Persian Gulf becomes a constant pressure point. Any skirmish, oil disruption, or miscalculation could set off global panic in energy markets. Insurance rates for oil tankers triple. The price of crude spikes every time a fishing boat drifts too close to a shipping lane. And then there are the proxies. Hezbollah, no longer getting clear directives from Tehran, may fracture into rival factions, some more radical, some more independent. The Houthis in Yemen may become entirely autonomous warlords. Shiite militias in Iraq may start bidding wars for foreign sponsorship, playing China, Russia, or even rogue Gulf players off each other. Meanwhile, inside Iran itself, regional separatist movements, Kurds, Arabs, Baluchis, push harder, demanding autonomy or outright independence, further slicing up what was once a unified, albeit authoritarian state. And hovering over it all, the great powers. China, with its Belt and Road ambitions, sees infrastructure projects and oil contracts ripe for the taking. Russia, always eager for chaos it can manage, offers military advisors and stability consultants to whichever warlord seems most pliable. The United States and Europe, already exhausted from 2 decades of Middle Eastern misadventures, struggled to decide whether to intervene, contain, or simply watch. What once was a nuclear crisis has now mutated into something far more unmanageable, a regional realignment driven not by diplomacy but by entropy. And the world will quickly discover that while nuclear war is terrifying, political collapse can be even more destabilizing. Because you can deter missiles, you can't deter chaos. And so, as the dust settles, figuratively and quite literally, we're left staring at one of the great geopolitical paradoxes of our age. Operation Rising Lion may have eliminated Iran's nuclear threat, but it may also have eliminated Iran itself.
at least in any recognizable form. A world without a nuclear Iran? That was the dream. A world without an Iranian regime? That's the nightmare nobody was quite prepared for. Because while missiles can be counted and centrifuges can be dismantled, power vacuums have no off switch. They spin, they devour, and they invite opportunists from every corner of the planet. Israel may have won the battle, but what grows in the ruins of its victory may prove far harder to contain. Will reformist forces seize this rare, fragile moment to build something new? Or will the region be swallowed by warlords, proxies, and external meddlers vying for control? And for the rest of us? Well, we'll feel it too, at the pump, in global markets, in UN summits filled with serious faces and empty solutions, in the headlines that bounce between hope and horror. This is the cost of preemption. Sometimes you pull the thorn only to unleash the bleeding. But, as always, history is far from finished. And speaking of unfinished history, next week on What If Horizons, we dive even deeper. What if a decapitated Iran becomes the world's next failed state? Will it become the Syria of the 2030s? A new Afghanistan? Or something even stranger? A Wild West in the heart of the Middle East where oil, ideology, and ambition collide? You won't want to miss it. Make sure to hit subscribe, leave us a review, and share this episode with your fellow geopolitical junkies. Until next time, this is What If Horizons, where the news gets weird and the future gets weirder.